Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for those of you who are joining from the United States. And my name's Duncan Edwards. I'm the CEO of British American Business, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this global trade panel, a discussion that we're holding in partnership with our good friends from AIG. And this event forms part of the AIG Global Trade Series that we've been pleased to be involved with over the last few years. And for those of you who are interested in the kind of global trade issues, I urge you to check out the other podcasts in the Global Trade Series, which you can find by going to the AIG website. And one of my colleagues will also put a link to the Global Trade Series in the chat today. Trade is clearly an important pillar of the work that we do at British American Business. And in recent years, the Western consensus view about global trade has certainly become less universally supported. I would argue that the last 4 years, there has been really no active trade policy from the USA, certainly no liberalizing trade policy from the USA, for example. Lots of things have contributed to this change: COVID, the war in Ukraine, US-led concerns about China, a dysfunctional WTO, industrial policy, securonomics. These are all issues that are pointing towards changed attitudes towards free trade. And these are issues that we want to try to unpack today. And to do that, we have an absolutely brilliant panel of experts who are going to lead us through these topics. And to introduce them and to moderate the conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Rem Korteweg, Senior Research Fellow at the Clingendael Institute. So great to see you, Rem, and I will pass to you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. It's a great pleasure to work with you and your team again over at BAB. Also, a big thank you to Emma, Emmanuel, Alice for making this possible. And also a big thank you to AIG for their sustained support in making the Global Trade Series possible. Now, Duncan already shed a little bit of light on what we hope to do over the next hour or so. Let me very briefly run you through the house rules of today's conversation. So the discussion with our 4 experts will be about 35-40 minutes, and hopefully that'll leave enough time also to get your questions in. So what I would already encourage you to do from the get-go is to use on the one hand, the raise your hand feature on Zoom, which is, I think, in the bottom corner, and put your questions in the chat function. And I will, at some point, hopefully be able to give you the opportunity to ask your question on camera to our experts. Also, just as a matter of practical logistics, please keep your mics on mute when you're not speaking. That holds for both the panelists as well as for the participants. And also, as a matter of clarity, this is going to be recorded, and hopefully we'll be able to make this possible on both the BAB website as well as the AIG Global Trade Series website. And so for those of you who are speaking and are going to share their insights, we are on the record. Now, let's get started. As Duncan mentioned, the topic of today's discussion is time to redefine free trade, ? Now, geopolitical frictions and domestic concerns are changing the debate about the benefits of trade. States are playing a growing role in shaping how trade relations and supply chains take shape. The WTO speaks of an era of re-globalization as economic security and supply chain resilience become new priorities for businesses and governments, and trade links are being reconfigured. Now, experts and commentators say that we are actually seeing increasing signs of trade fragmentation. Whatever it is, the role of governments is definitely increasing as the demand for worker-centric trade policies, industrial policies, tariffs, export controls, and subsidies appear to be pushing out traditional Western beliefs in free trade. Now, what does this mean for the future trade landscape? How do electoral politics play into this? And what does it mean for the future of multilateral trade? And to make sense of this, I'm joined by four terrific speakers who I will very briefly introduce to you. Firstly, we will hear from London from Emily Lydgate. Emily is Professor of Environmental Law. She's co-director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory and Deputy Director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy at the University of Sussex. It's great to have her with us. After that, we will hear from Matthew Goodman. Matthew Goodman is Fellow and Director of the Greenberg Center of Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Then we'll move to Jennifer Hillman, who needs no introduction, but is Professor of Practice at Georgetown Law Center and one of America's most eminent experts on multilateral trade and the WTO. And last but not least, I'm very pleased to welcome Peter Harrell, who's non-resident scholar at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment here in Washington, D.C. And of course, from January 2021 through 2022, Peter served as Senior Director for International Economics, jointly appointed to both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. In other words, we have really four big hitters to share their insights with you. So let's start with Emily first. Last week's UK elections led to a big change. The British voted out the Conservative government after 14 years, and Labour has signalled a shift in terms of their approach to, among other things, the European Union, though falling short of calling for a reversal of Brexit. And senior Labour politicians over the past couple of months have been talking a lot about a new concept that has trade connotations, namely securonomics. Now, what does this mean for trade? And what do you, Emily, expect the new UK government's trade policy to focus on?
Thanks, Rem. It's great to be here. So I think I'll start with kind of the big picture of Labour on trade. So actually, Labour said really very little on trade. So unlike the Conservatives, it doesn't seem to be an important part of its kind of explicit policy agenda. And I think like the US, the UK election is really focused on domestic crises. Remember, we've just experienced the largest decline in household income since records began. But trade is, of course, implicated. And also, I think it will really be at the heart of some of the hard choices facing the Labour government. So I'll say something very briefly on what I see as the top three trade policy issues and what we might expect. The first one, sorry to US colleagues, is EU cooperation and integration. So Keir Starmer's central policy is growth. He wants a government of, quote, stability and moderation. This is clearly defined in contrast to the Brexit era. And as you mentioned, Rem, it follows that Labour would seek to lessen EU trade barriers, which have harmed UK growth. They have made some moves in this direction by identifying, without getting into technical details, some of the more ridiculous trade barriers that they want to address. Labour, however, is also really sensitive about public concerns about losing sovereignty. So you might describe this as the Brexit hangover. So the overall policy seems to be get a bit closer to the EU, but not too close, remain quiet about it, and hope that the anti-EU faction and the pro-EU faction aren't too disappointed. I'm not sure how that is going to work out, but I think that a second Trump administration would probably be the best single thing that could happen for EU-UK cooperation and closer ties. So the second issue is subsidies. So we've been told repeatedly, including by Labour, that the country has no money. But Labour also wants to restore public services, prop up British manufacturing, and fund the low-carbon transition. So remember, this is the Labour Party. And in the world of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are strong elements within that party that would quite like to emulate Bidenomics. And I think there will be division within the party about how to manage this tension between fiscal responsibility and subsidies. And then relatedly, the final thing is multilateralism. So the UK economy is really different from the US economy. It's deindustrialized, it's a services-led economy. We're really good at developing cutting-edge technologies, but not at manufacturing them and exporting them. You know, Starmer set out a vision for a pragmatic government. The pragmatic position here is open trade. multilateral trade, diversified supply chain. So, we started off talking about redefining what trade means in the global trade system. The UK doesn't actually have much national interest in that. But our key allies do. So I see strategic dilemmas for the UK when deciding, for example, what to do if the Trump administration, a Trump administration decides that the UK should, introduce tariffs on China or face US tariffs, that kind of thing. So how will Labour handle these challenges? So this brings us to Securenomics, Rachel Reeves, the new UK Chancellor's proposal, which I see as a masterclass in constructive ambiguity in terms of sketching out how the UK will deal with these choices. But I think these are the areas to watch. And I also think that what we're about to see is a masterclass in how much courage it takes to pursue a pragmatic approach to trade policy in the current climate that we're in.
Thanks so much, Emily. That's great, and hopefully we'll have a chance to follow up, to dig a little bit deeper on how you think also the US-UK relationship might change in the context of the new electoral balance in the UK. But let me bring in Matthew. Matt, turning to the US, how would you characterize US trade policy? And let me frame it a little bit more poignantly. What's your diagnosis and what's the prescription? Where should US trade policy focus on?
Well, thanks, Rem, and thanks to BAB for inviting me to do this. So look, trade policy has been changing over the last, two administrations, and it isn't going to return to where it was before that. We are in a sort of new era, I think, of trade policy here in the United States. I think the basic arguments for trade are not fundamentally changed. That is, trade is still seen as something, and it is something that provides broad, benefits in terms of growth and efficiency, but there are elements of the effects of trade that have required a new thinking on trade policy. Obviously, the distributional consequences of trade have loomed a lot larger in recent years, and the inequality that it has fed in part, along with other changes in our economy and policies that have reinforced that. And obviously, all the issues around sustainability and the impact of the climate on the trading system, I think, is a new element. And then finally, another new element out there that is, I think, shaping the debate is the role of the state in the market. When David Ricardo wrote about comparative advantage in trade, he really only was focused on two basic actors, producers and consumers. He really didn't focus on a third player, which is government as a shaper of comparative advantage and of markets. And clearly, that has been a new factor, frankly, with the rise of China as a large and very heavily state interventionist economy. So all of that has changed the debate around trade policy. And I think you're going to see that whoever wins, and there are now three possibilities, I guess, of who might win an election in November here, but whoever that is, there's going to be a very different approach. And it's great that Peter Harrell's on, because he's got some specific ideas. If President Biden or potentially some other Democrat wins the election, there may be a new approach on that side of the aisle. I think Donald Trump's view on trade, it's one of the few issues on which he actually has a strong policy view, and I think you can expect that he is going to follow through on what he's promised of sharply raising tariffs on China and trying to raise tariffs on pretty much everyone and everything else. Whether he'll succeed in all of that is another question, but I think that's certainly among the things that he's going to do. So we're going to have quite an interesting period ahead of new forms of trade policy that are going to build on some of the interesting developments we've already had. I don't think it's going to play heavily. You didn't ask this, but since I'm sure that's a question in a lot of people's minds, I don't think it's going to play that heavily in the actual election outcome. Trade rarely does. It's not a primary issue on voters' minds, but certainly it'll be an important part of the policy discussions, whoever wins.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And turning to Jennifer, I mean, this obviously all, whether it's Securenomics in the UK, emulation of Inflation Reduction Act or diversification, and what Matt is describing about where we might see US trade policy heading. This, of course, takes place in a context of international trade law and trade agreements. What does this mean for the WTO? Is this a singular Western phenomenon that Europeans and Americans like to talk about, and how is this viewed, elsewhere that are sort of our other trading partners? Oh, you're on mute, Jennifer.
I'm so sorry. Ram, thank you very much. It is really always a pleasure to be affiliated with the AIG Global Trade Series, and a thank you to BAB for including me. Let me just start with, is this just a US thing that is happening, or really is it, again, more global? And when I say, what is this thing? To me, the thing is this notion of walking away from the multilateral rules-based system, that has it resides at its core at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And to me, the answer is it is more true in the United States, but the things that are pushing back against a rules-based system, I think, are global ones. I mean, you start with the rise of China, and it is clear that it is felt, if you will, more keenly and is being fought more keenly in the United States. But you are increasingly seeing everyone from, G7 communiques to even much more broader coalitions that are also recognizing the huge problems that have resulted from the amount of overcapacity and the increasing amount of state-owned enterprise activity in China, and the increasing threats that China is posing to the national security of many of the developed countries. So that is a global phenomenon. Secondly, you're clearly seeing this notion that national security becomes the driver by which the lens through which we see our trade policy. And yes, that is more true in the United States, but it is clearly true everywhere where national security becomes part of the calculus for how do we think about what are the right trade rules, are the rules that will protect us from national security risks, not just, from trade-related phenomena. The third thing that is really driving the bus, if you will, in terms of this pushback to the WTO and a rules-based system is the rise of regionalism. You are simply seeing more and more consolidation within sort of the Americas, within the European Union, and very much within Asia, where a huge amount of trade is now increasingly intra-regional. And to me, that's only going to increase. Why? Because where you see the big growth in trade is in services, not in trade in goods, and especially in digital services and digital intermediate services. And of all the things in which actually time zones kind of matter, it is that trade in intermediate digital services. So you are going to continue to see this kind of rise of regionalism, which has its effect at sort of pushing back on the sort of global phenomenon. And last but absolutely not least is this growing perception that the WTO is sort of not fit for purpose. And here I do think it is important to recognize that there are differing notions of what's wrong with the WTO. I mean, for many of the recent trade policy makers in the United States, the argument was simply if the WTO cannot solve the United States' problems with China, then the WTO is not worth fixing, saving, investing in. For developing countries, I mean, there's a huge argument that the WTO has not delivered economic growth to poorer countries. In a variety of countries, the concern is the WTO has not played a forceful enough role in delivering on climate change, on global health pandemic trade, on gender equity, on shrinking the overall income inequality gaps. So again, a whole lot of disdain, if you will, for the WTO. Now, I personally am not sure that I share all of that, and I think there's a lot of good news in terms of what the WTO can do, but it is clear that it's not just a US phenomenon. It is global. It is part of this kind of waning faith, I think, around the world in institutions more generally, whether that's governments, the press, multilateral institutions, the courts, religious institutions. There is simply a waning faith in institutions that feeds into this broader sort of narrative about how confident are we in the multilateral rules-based system and the WTO to implement it.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. And Peter, turning to you now. I mean, Jennifer notes, I think, very eloquently that this isn't just a US phenomenon, but of course, what the US does matters. And in many respects, US policy acts as an excuse for other countries not to step up or to pursue kind of quasi-protectionist policies of their own, whether that's true or not. So in other words, the US, of course, is massively important. And you've written a number of recent articles with evocative titles like Time to Reset the US Trade Agenda and How to Save Free Trade. Well, let's put the question to you. How do we save free trade, and how should we reset the US trade agenda? And if you are able to also shed a bit of light on what we might expect from another Democratic administration, that would be really insightful.
No, and let me join Jennifer and Matthew and Emily and thanking you, Ram, and thanking the association for bringing us together for this important and timely conversation. And let me begin by saying I very much agree with the kind of diagnosis that both Matthew and Jennifer laid out about how the United States at least got to where it is on trade policy. I think you have seen a growing concern with the distributional impacts of trade. And I think you've also seen, as Jennifer says, this kind of deep skepticism here in the US of a growing range of institutions, very much including global trade institutions, including the WTO. And of course, we do have this reality of the rise of China as a geopolitical competitor, and much of the idea of the current global trading order, which we created with the WTO in the late 80s through kind of 2001, was premised on the idea you could have trade kind of existing outside of geopolitics and focused primarily on issues of efficiency and economic development globally, but not really having to think about geopolitics as a core aspect of trade. And we are clearly, from a U.S. perspective, at an inflection point where the geopolitics is real. I don't think another next president, whether another Democratic president, Joe Biden, or another Democratic president, or Donald Trump, is ever again, well, again, ever is a very long time. Call it the next 10 to 20 years is going to see China as a trading partner that should in any way be on par with a country like the UK or Germany that's a treaty ally. I just view these should be different kinds of trading relationships because there is a geopolitical reality. And so I think you are going to continue to see an emphasis on a different set of rules for China and its bloc than you have for a kind of G7 and other allied trading bloc. And then I also think there's a sense here in the United States that the existing trading order has not really been solving problems for the United States. Like, I think we have to look, and I come at this from an American perspective, but, well, I think everybody on this Zoom believes very sincerely, and any economist would argue, free trade, and including the U.S. participation in free trade, has been net beneficial to the United States. There is also a statistical fact that there was a long period of stagnant wage growth in the United States. It essentially began when China came into the WTO in 2001, and that lasted to basically 2015. I think it's sort of coincidental, and actually the increase in median real wage growth we've seen in the United States slightly predated Donald Trump's presidency. But I think we have to grapple with the fact that we've actually seen quite strong median real wage growth in the United States since the U.S. began to retreat from some of these global institutions and global norms. And so I think a set of arguments that kind of is, the U.S. should get back to free trade for the reasons that it historically got to free trade, just isn't going to work in the United States. And so what I have argued is that a Democrat should do is really reconceptualize what are the goals of a trade liberalizing agenda from a set of goals that is kind of about growth and increasing trade, because, frankly, we've seen economic growth here in the United States. We've seen trade volumes increase. Like, a lot of those things are happening. And if you want to put, deals on the table, you got to think about what is going to energize the American public and what are the kinds of problems we can solve that I think trade is essential to solving. And for a Democrat here, I do think climate is one of those, right? How do we actually build a trading order that facilitates our, global climate ambitions? And I think you've seen over the last couple of months, the White House announced that it's launching a climate and trade task force, looking at how a re-elected President Biden could really move forward with a very aggressive multilateral trade and climate agenda. I think kind of regulating on a multilateral basis among allies, AI and the digital economy. Clearly, AI is going to be enormously disruptive to all of us, and the kind of beginning of sort of myriad independent regulations of the digital economy across the globe are not going to benefit anyone for all the reasons Jennifer laid out. So I think that's an area where you could see the U.S. and a re-elected Democratic administration showing some leadership. And then I think this kind of idea of you hear in the UK as well of kind of economic security. What does an economic security and sort of supply chain resilience compact look like in practice is something I could see a re-elected Biden administration go to. But I think these are going to be, agreements that are going to be more sectoral. They're going to be framed more as solving discrete problems rather than framed as market liberalization. And they will not have a global architecture to them. They will be looking at bespoke mixes of high income industrial as well as kind of like-minded, or countries we want to encourage to be like-minded from the developing world. So I think there is a potential there in a second Democratic administration to see some path forward. I'll just comment briefly. I am not a Trump Republican. I'm a Biden Democrat. But I think, like others on this call, I spend a fair amount of time with Trump Republicans. And I do just want to echo what I think Matt said at the beginning of, I think we should expect, if Trump is reelected, he is going to take a quite different approach that is not just about increasing tariffs on China. He does want to increase on tariffs on China. But I think he and his senior advisors like Bob Lighthizer actually have a kind of view of trade that there was simply too much liberalization, and that the kind of current U.S. bound tariff rates are in fact too low. And that is why they are fairly serious about moving forward with a whether it's 10% or ends up being slightly lower or slightly higher, there's a lot to be known, but I think they are quite committed to trying to reset kind of base U.S. tariff rates, including with allies and partners. But the flip side is I also think that they would be willing and interested in, over a couple of years, cutting some deals with various allies and partners in the trade space, both as a way of getting allies and partners to correct what the Trump folks see as unfair economic practices by them, but also, frankly, as a way of locking in and legitimizing their effort to reset global tariff rates. Because if you kind of raise U.S. tariffs and then you strike a deal with an ally that kind of accepts some degree of higher tariffs, in a way, you've kind of legitimized in a beginning of a global order, a different kind of system from what many of us, I think, hope for, but you are creating some legitimacy for sort of a different kind of trading system.
Thanks so much, Peter. That's really good. I mean, how you unpack it, not necessarily the policies that you set out that Trump might pursue. I just want to follow up on your sort of the three elements you sketched on where you might see a second Biden administration or a second Democratic administration focus on. And you mentioned climate and trade, AI and the digital economy, and economic security and supply chain resilience. At the same time, you mentioned this might lead more to sectoral deals not being part of a global architecture. You didn't mention the word WTO, but that's kind of inferred that a second Democratic administration wouldn't necessarily focus on the WTO. Is that a correct assumption on my part, or do you see any room for WTO or WTO-like agreements on some of these issues that you mentioned?
Well, I think there's an active debate, and Jennifer, I'm sure, and Matt have views on this as well. I think there's a very active debate within kind of democratic trade circles about what the right way forward on the WTO is. I think there is sort of on the Democratic side of the ledger. I think, Trump Republicans by and large dismissive of the WTO, but on the Democratic side of the ledger, I think there is a recognition that almost universal recognition that our allies and partners care a lot about this institution, and B, that there is value to a kind of baseline global trading order. Even if the U.S. feels like the U.S. could negotiate a bunch of bilateral or plurilateral deals, you need a kind of global trading order for Mexico to trade with South Africa and for Malaysia to trade with Thailand. And that there is some value even among the skeptics that the WTO can really be saved to not just upending it and sort of tossing it away. But I think there is also a lot of debate where the WTO has China as a member, where the prospects for meaningful reform are extremely hard. I think there's a lot of debate about whether it is really worthwhile to focus a bunch of political capital, which is, one of those things that is a scarce resource in any capital, but to spend a lot of political capital on it. So I don't think you'd see a Democratic administration ever, sort of upend the WTO or formally, sort of object to it. But I think there was a debate that is ongoing and hard to know how it'll be resolved about whether there would be a meaningful effort to try to move it to a better trajectory, or whether you'd see the sort of benign neglect that I think we've broadly seen over the last 3.5 years.
Great, terrific. Let me also bring in a couple of voices from our participants. I have noted that Emmanuel Adam has a question, and then Stephanie AIG. So, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel Adam from British American Business. Happy to kick things off. Good to see you all. Would agree, a fantastic panel. Maybe a question to Emily, which may also apply to everyone on the panel, which is, where do we take things from here when it comes to actual advocacy? British American Business, that's what we do. We try to improve the economic relationship between the US and the UK, and there are several ways how to get there. And maybe starting with the Labour government, you've said trade wasn't as much on the agenda, but obviously Jonathan Reynolds will have to do something. And what would be your suggestion in how we approach now conversations with the new secretary and his team, and maybe even the prime minister? Do we go full in and say, don't give up on an FTA? Or do we look at sector deals as they have been proposed in the past? Or do we rather say, let's work in existing fora and see how we can build over time a more proper agenda down the line? What would be your immediate suggestion? Thank you.
And Emily, just a footnote to that, what I'd also be very interested for you to reflect on is what you've heard Matt, Jennifer, and Peter both describe as sort of the US approach. And the UK has a different trading exposure to China. Is it able to balance in, on the one hand, partnering with the US as well as trying to continue its trading relationship with China, or will it be forced to choose?
Yeah, I mean, I think those questions are interrelated in a sense, and they get back to the point I was trying to make about the UK being in the minority and having a lot of its interests aligned with multilateral cooperation. So, well, really good example of that is electric vehicles. So we have the US introduced tariffs, and the EU against Chinese electric vehicles, but the UK hasn't. And half the domestic commentariat say, hey, we don't have the fiscal headroom as these guys. Let's just enjoy these cheap EVs, right? And so I don't think we're clear whether this is our ideological battle against China. I think it's very divided. or whether we're just doing it because our friends are. So in terms of what, how should the UK position itself in the advice, it's really hard to answer that without knowing if we're dealing with the Trump administration, obviously, or a Biden administration, because I think the answers are very, very different. But I certainly can see a lot of room for sectoral cooperation in terms of, the net zero transition, the idea, the fact that, the friend-shoring agenda across the net zero transition in areas like critical minerals, EVs, et cetera, could suggest some shared objectives, digital economy, the idea of how we kind of regulate and cooperate on AI. So I think there are definitely sectoral issues in which there's room to discuss. But it seems to me the FTA ship has sailed, because if it's Labor Biden, then Biden administration aren't going to want it. If it's Labor Trump, then even if Trump wants it, it'll be really hard for the Labor administration. So I think it's going to be sectoral cooperation.
Thank you. Interesting.
Does any of the other panelists want to come in on this?
I'd only underscore two quick points. One is, I think Emily is exactly right. A whole lot of how far and either another Democratic administration or Trump administration is willing to go is going to be premised on how close the UK is willing to join with the United States in pushing back on China. And again, that does put the UK in a very difficult position. But so much of US policy is now, are you with us on specific measures to push back on China? And the second thing is just to, flag again how much there is concern hanging over all of this of the real cost of further fragmentation in the system. I mean, again, study after study, really showing that if we continue to go down this road of creating a fragmented sort of trading system in which certain lanes are privileged and others are not, it does have a huge effect on overall global GDP. I mean, the WTO IMF studies, could put the number even as high as, a cost of 7% of global GDP if we end up fragmenting the entire trading system into these trading blocks. So again, just as a point of background, and the last little point is, there are still some of these issues that you really can't resolve very easily in a sectoral or a bilateral or even a regional agreement. I mean, and services is the one that I would say just comes to the fore, because it's just very hard to conceive of everybody regulating their services markets differently, depending on whether you're a free trade partner or a friend partner or not, because again, the regulation of services doesn't really kind of work that way. Ditto on intellectual property. I mean, ideas are just going to flow around the globe. You're not going to be able to sort of create completely different IP systems depending on whether somebody's a friend or not. So there are certain of the trade issues that to me are simply going to remain global issues. So you're not going to be able to resolve all of those without moving to some kind of a WTO global kind of rules-based system. And you could probably add some other issues into that list of not easily resolved on a sectoral basis.
Terrific. Stephanie AIG.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. Stephanie AIG with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. In my work and my team's work, we work with businesses to help them export. We also help them manage their international supply chains. The companies we work with depend on international sales. They also depend on imports as a source of inputs. But yet we've spent the last 3 years at least really talking about a worker-centric trade policy. I would love to get you all's off-the-record comments on that and what that really means and how it's been effective. But that aside, is there an opportunity now, starting soon, for businesses to start to redirect the conversation back to how trade benefits them, and whether that's whether that comes in the form of associations kind of carrying the water for them on that, or them themselves kind of coming up with sort of a public campaign around this? My concern is just that we're talking so much about how trade policy is supposed to correct every single other thing other than free trade. And yet we're not talking very much about how businesses benefit from free trade and then employ workers. And so the United States and UK, other countries benefit from this. And I just wonder, is there going to be a time when that conversation can be at least balanced a little bit?
So let's see if Matt and or Peter want to take this. I see Matt nodding, so let's give him
Sure. It's
first
good to
bite.
see you, Stephanie, and great question. And I do think this is important to stress, as I think several, if not all of us said, that trade does, provide, significant net benefits. I don't think that basic logic has changed. And if that's true, then part of that is the benefit to our competitiveness and to our ability to to find markets for our products and services, and for us to be able to obtain the the inputs that we need, as you said. And we need to be talking about those things as well, even as we're talking about some of the new questions around, or renewed questions around the distributional effects of trade, around the national security dimensions, which I, by the way, didn't mention in my opening, and is obviously an important new factor that others have stressed in all of this. So I do think that is something that the U.S. government certainly, and I think the UK government as well, should be talking about and should be doing things to make the case for trade, but while also acknowledging that that there are distributional challenges, there are climate-related challenges, there are national security related challenges, and China ones. And let me just say one other thing that I wanted to say, if I don't have time to say it in response to another question. I do think in all of this, we need to remember that certainly from a U.S. perspective, we have traditionally, in order to get the things we've wanted through trade, we've always been willing to offer something, and that something has traditionally been greater access to our market, the largest market in the world, largest consumer market in the world. And this administration and the last one really have not been willing to make that offer, at least an unconditional offer. There may be new variations of this where it's sort of a slightly more negative approach to market access, where it's sort of, we won't deny you market access that you have now if you do the things we want to. That's a kind of incentive, I guess, but not necessarily going to get the responses we want from people. So I think in our trade policy, we have to be offering something, and that includes the things that you're asking about, Stephanie, because we're offering access to our market that helps us as well get the access to inputs that we need, and products and services that we need, and it offers good products and services to the rest of the world. That's part of our offering as well. So I think we need to talk more about this, and we're talking about all the things we want. And as an American, I want those things too, many of them. But I think we need to, if we want those things, we have to be willing to put something out there. And if it isn't market access, we need to kind of with something creative that is appealing to our trading partners.
Peter, is the U.S. putting enough on the table? Is the U.S. offer tasty enough to get other trading partners to follow suit?
Well, I do want to pick up on something Matt said. I think not so much with a Biden or Democratic administration, but I do think with a Trump administration, I think they would have I liked, Matt, your characterization as sort of a negative incentive, because I think their view is sort of, the U.S. has historically offered too much market access, and they aren't against deals, but they kind of want to reset the baseline and then negotiate from there. And I think I think we will see, quite a bit of negative incentive, as Matt would say, but also actually a fair amount of negotiation in a Trump administration, much as we frankly did with China during the first Trump go round, where you saw an enormous number of tariffs imposed, but you also saw these kind of tactical deals that he cut, and I just think you'd see that on a grander scale. But I want to, for a Biden administration, come back to this question of what is a worker-centered trade policy, and then thinking about kind of corporate interests. And I will say, I think the Biden administration has been maybe more conceptual than tangible in what they mean about a worker-centered trade policy. But I think in that conceptual idea, it is they want to think about trade policy that emphasizes, production and workers in the United States, and not simply costs for consumers and also corporate kind of corporate bottom lines. And I think it's coming from actually kind of in a way like a moral and theoretical view of people are not just consumers and they don't just care about getting the lowest price. They also care about having kind of rewarding jobs and a kind of rewarding work. And again, you can disagree with it, but I think there is a kind of moral and theoretical view on the part of Catherine Tai and others that we should have more of an emphasis on what is serving workers and less of an emphasis on what is serving consumers and corporate interests. And again, you can disagree, but I think as a sincerely held view, I do think, just being blunt from a Democratic, but I think also a Republican perspective, emphasizing what's good for companies in the U.S. is unlikely to be very helpful as a narrative. I think there's a strong sense what we're at, record equity valuations in this country, we're at record corporate profits. I don't think very many people in Washington have a sense that companies are doing poorly here at least here in the United States. I think there's a sense that companies are doing just fine. Again, not arguing the merits here. I'm simply saying politically, at the very least, that is sincerely held, at least among many Democrats. And so I think you want to argue for market opening by the U.S., you do need to kind of break it down and make it more tangible. If we are going to have meet our green goals, we are not going to mine all of those minerals here in the United States, nor frankly, are we going to build all the batteries or all the solar panels here in the United States. And so I think we need to have a bit more of a tangible conversation about, you have these goals you want to meet that you, Democratic leadership, you, Washington, you, the American people, say are important, and you can't actually do it without, importing some stuff, at the very least from our a broad swath of our friends and allies. And I think making those very kind of tangible arguments about, here's what we need to source and why, and here's how it serves this bigger agenda. That's the kind of thing that helps rebuild political support, at least on the Democratic side.
Can I chime in just one second where Peter left off? Because I do think this is, the really key rub in the United States is the political dynamic. Because we've now seen a whole series of studies come out that have looked in pretty great detail about the impact of the Trump tariffs, the tariffs on steel and aluminum and the big tariffs on China. And some of these done, by the very same economists that did the study saying what a China shock had done and how bad that was for the American worker and for various communities. Big economic studies coming out that bottom line are saying that the Trump tariffs have not produced more jobs, have not produced more productivity, have not, in essence, helped the protected industries, that the retaliation, when you add that on top of it, has resulted in a net negative to the United States. And you add on top of that we had to spend some $20 billion a year subsidizing the farmers that lost their markets because of the Chinese retaliation. And the bottom line of, were these tariffs good for the United States? Answer, no, but unequivocally, they are politically popular. The data that is very convincing is that those significantly moved the needle in favor of the Republican Party, in favor of Trump. So what you are looking at is a United States in which, a trade policy that economically is not really helping is wildly politically popular. So Peter is exactly right. You're going to have to figure out a way to change that political calculus and that political narrative in order to create some space to move in a different direction.
I am going to be a ruthless moderator because we have only 10 minutes left on the clock, and I at least have 2 questions that I want to put to the 4 of you. So we're going to take those 2 together, and then we'll give you all a chance to respond. So first, from Jay Eisenstadt.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rem, and thanks to everybody. This has been a really engaging conversation. I particularly appreciate the recent scholarship from Matt and Peter. It's been quite insightful. I wanted to take the conversation back to the Indo-Pacific, if I could, and to focus in particular on China, because I think we can all agree that there is a strong need to continue to focus policy pressure in the geopolitical, national security, and international economic space to confront what are some very troubling practices being undertaken by China, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's their nefarious impact on investing in Africa or WTO inconsistent subsidization, et cetera. Like no questions there, but it has seemed to me for the last number of years that there's been a missed opportunity to triangulate from a national security perspective, from a geosecurity perspective, from an international economic perspective, pressure on China by reviving in some way engagement with our primary Southeast Asian Indo-Pacific trading partners. Now, I know, I'm from my time at USTR, a vestige of the early stages of TPP, so I'm not necessarily advocating for return to that, which is probably politically, if not structurally, challenging. But it seems to me that a gaping hole in both Trump administration and Biden administration trade policy has been an inability to really fill that void in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the single biggest mistake that the U.S. has made going back now 8 years is the decision, well, by then candidate Hillary Clinton and candidate Trump to pledge to withdraw the U.S. From TPP, Trump's decision as president to do that. And then, as I said, leaving this massive policy vacuum in the Indo-Pacific. And by the way, IPEF has been, despite all the window dressing, a complete failure. I mean, there is no substantive meaning to it, meat to it. There's been no impact. And the last point I would leave you with, just from a job, Peter, I think you raised an excellent point on job creation. Export-oriented U.S. jobs pay by far more than jobs that focus on production for U.S. markets. And it seems to me that even if you view U.S. trade policy as being quote unquote worker-centric, that the sort of jobs we should be promoting and we should be creating are ones that are as much export-oriented as those for domestic production. So again, it would be great to get your views on just sort of our broader engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but then tying that back into worker-centric.
Thanks very much, Jay. And last question is from William Cannon. Is William online?
Yes, William is online. I just wanted to ask how the UK should think about positioning itself to secure the best possible trade deal with the US under a new Trump tariff-based order. Calling you from the British consulate.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a question. I mean, even though Jay said it's not about IPEF and CPTPP. Should there be a IPEF for CPTPP 2.0? And a question on how the UK should respond and relate to Trump trade policy. Let's kick off with Matt and then have the others chip in. And we have 6 minutes on the clock. So
okay. I'll try to do it in one. First by saying Jay made excellent points, and I basically endorse his fundamental point that we have a big hole in our strategy in the Indo-Pacific, critical region of the world to us on a lot of levels. And we need to fill that hole with something. It's not going to be TPP. I don't think that is a viable path forward, but I do think the U.S. needs to do something more than what it did in IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which had a pretty good list of issues. There's nothing wrong really with the list of sort of trade and supply chain and resilient infrastructure and anti-corruption and so forth. Those are all good topics, but there wasn't enough. Again, I go back to my point about offer. We weren't really putting enough on the table to incentivize our partners to want to do business with us on those issues. And so I think there is a huge hole. Partners in the region want the U.S. out there engaged in the region on all levels. We're there as a military and security force, but that's welcome, but it's not sufficient. We have to have something credible to offer on economics. And I think that's the big challenge for the next administration is what is that thing going to be? It's probably not going to be TPP or IPEF, but it has to be something.
Peter, can I ask you for your final sort of 60 seconds?
Yeah, well, I guess I agree with Matt that I think it is unlikely that the U.S. Goes back into TPP, and I also think, well, IPEF I think has had a couple of modest successes on information sharing on supply chains and like. It's clearly not answering the need out in the Indo-Pacific. I guess I'm frankly a little skeptical that I have any clear vision about what will. I mean, if you look at trade volumes, the Indo-Pacific has been a massive winner with the U.S. absent TPP. Vietnam now exports a quarter of its GDP to the United States, absent any trade deal whatsoever. U.S. imports from Thailand and India, they're all way up. So there's a part of me that is a little bit sympathetic to, if you just look at the trade values, they've gotten a ton of benefit from China nearshoring without any China friendshoring, not nearshoring, for sort of the move away from China without any the U.S. really doing anything, which actually raises the question of, well, actually, shouldn't the U.S. have gotten something from these countries if they were going to start, exporting all of this stuff to the United States, which I think is a fair debate to be had. But I'm actually a little bit skeptical what we're going to offer that is going to give them more than they have gained through the China diversification economics that is driving massive increases in trading volumes from across the Indo-Pacific to the U.S. So it kind of comes back to my core argument of from a U.S. perspective. I think we have to reconceptualize what this is going to be about.
And Peter, any quick thoughts for William on how the UK should position itself to get the best deal with the US under a Trump administration?
Look, what do I know? Trump's a tactical negotiator. I could joke, well, offer him more golf courses in Scotland, but assuming that's off the table, I think you just have to be prepared to do a tactical negotiation with him, right? I think he's gonna expect that you'll threaten him back with market access and tariffs of your own, reducing U.S. market access, and I think you just kind of have to be prepared for a tough tactical negotiation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Over to you.
Well, thanks. I'll only add, I don't disagree at all with Peter in terms of be ready to be very, very tactical on this. And the one thing, like I said, that's going to be hard for the UK is whether there's a way to join in the, if you will, the fight against China, the pushback against China, and to try to figure out where and whether the UK has any room to be seen as an ally of the United States is in the pushback to China. And then go to sort of Jay's broader questions. I completely agree with everything that Jay and Matt and others have said about it. To me, what is always interesting when you go to the WTO, is the kind of odd reaction, not odd, but the sort of dual perception within the building, if you will, the WTO, of questioning, why does the United States want to take on China alone? I mean, why are you constantly all by yourselves in engaging in this fight? This doesn't make any sense to us. And so the perception I've always had is, is there a way to use the WTO as one tool to challenge all of the China practices that are clearly violations of the WTO, and at the same time, again, to create broader coalitions that share a lot of the US concerns, particularly on the national security front vis-a-vis China, and to use that as a way of creating, because again, to me, it's not, I'm agreeing with Peter, it's not just about trade. It's literally about whether we're on the same kind of page, whether there's coordination, whether there is, the ability to act in under any kind of a framework where there is an agreement and a set of cooperation and just a consistent set of conversations about how we're approaching the concerns about China that would make a big difference. So I think there's room there on a number of fronts to come up with some different forum, but I'm otherwise completely agreeing with Matt and Peter.
Thanks, Jennifer. Great point. Conscious of time, Emily, you have the last word.
30 seconds. Trump is unpredictable, but I guess the other side of the flip side from tactical negotiating is that the U.S. putting up additional trade barriers creates opportunities elsewhere. So we're talking about China and decoupling from China, helping out the U.S. relations with other countries in the region. And similarly, if we have a kind of global turn away from the U.S. because of Trump's policies, then that opens up all kinds of other opportunities. Although I will say that the UK is a party to CPTPP, and it hasn't done much for our trade in the region.
Thanks so much. And with that, we've come full circle. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank our 4 excellent speakers, Peter, Harold, Matthew Goodman, Jennifer Hillman, and Emily Lydgate. I thought this was a terrific discussion. Of course, there's a lot more to discuss, but we'll have to leave that for another occasion. Also, please take a look at our AIG Global Trade Series podcasts, where we explore some of these issues in greater detail. And let me thank also very much British American Business, but I know that Duncan wants to send us off with the final word. So back to you, Duncan.
Well, only to say, I think this will make an excellent addition to the podcast series. It's been an absolutely terrific and fascinating discussion, and clearly we could delve into lots of these topics in a lot more detail. But thanks very much to the panelists, and particularly to you, Rem, for moderating the conversation so well. It was brilliantly handled and a real pleasure. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.